In the days before personal computers,
December 21st, 1968.
before the internet and the World Wide Web connected us to global information,
As the world listened and watched,
before smartphones connected us to one another,
Following. We hear you loud and clear, following.
before GPS guided our
the
journeys,
United States was undertaking the most distant voyage ever attempted by man.
before this technology was a part of everyday life, American astronauts explored new frontiers in space and on the moon.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
A half-century ago, men on board the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo space capsules talked to Earth, navigated in space and to the moon and back, and exchanged critical data with mission control. How was this accomplished 5 decades ago? By the ingenuity and dedication of a company founded in the heartland of America. The Collins Radio Company in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The Collins Story, connecting the moon to the Earth.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
In
No single
1961,
space project in
President
this
John F.
period
Kennedy's challenge
will be
to the
more
nation is
impressive to
daring
mankind
and
or
daunting.
more important.
The Mercury space program has just begun. Alan Shepard has just completed a 15-minute suborbital flight, becoming the first American in space. But Shepard's celebrated flight comes a month after the Soviet Union claims the title of putting the world's first man, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. The United States is not only in a Cold War with the Soviets, we are now also in a race to the moon.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
The country embraces the President's bold challenge. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, calls the program to land the first humans on the moon, Apollo. It requires a spacecraft and a rocket that at this time seems possible only in science fiction fantasy. It requires the engineering of a system to transmit human voices and critical mission information through Earth's atmosphere into deep space and back to Earth. Plus, a new element will be part of Apollo's venture, television. NASA names North American Aviation, a major aerospace manufacturer, as the prime contractor for the Apollo command and service modules. In December 1961, North American selects Collins Radio to develop the communication system on board the Apollo command module. Based in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Collins Radio has an international reputation for developing advanced radio communication and navigation technologies. Under the leadership of founder Arthur A. Collins, the company has also made significant contributions to early space communication. In the 1950s, the company sent a coded message from the Cedar Rapids Airport to Sterling, Virginia, by bouncing a high-powered radio signal off the moon. In Project Echo, it was first to transmit an image via satellite. The image was of President Eisenhower. The company also developed communication and navigation equipment for the X-15 hypersonic research plane, the first manned vehicle to explore the fringes of space. And the voice of Mercury astronaut Alan Shepard is heard over Collins radio equipment.
We're smoothing out some now, getting out of the vibration area.
For these achievements, Collins Radio might have seemed the logical choice for Project Apollo, but the competition to be a part of the prestigious space program is intense. In the end, Collins Radio is awarded contracts for 4 critical Apollo systems, including the communication system in the Apollo command module, the signal processor for the lunar module, a closed-circuit radio intercom system for the launch complex at Cape Kennedy, and a major upgrade and expansion of the manned spaceflight tracking system used for the Mercury and Gemini programs. The talents of nearly 600 of Arthur Collins' employees located across the country are required to think beyond the present-day technology to create and manufacture a communication and data system that will talk to the moon. 2 veteran engineering leaders are selected to lead Project Apollo for Collins Radio. Arthur Wolfsberg is Director of Spacecraft Systems, and Dr. Roger Pierce is Technical Director. Collins also has 6 key subcontractors for the command module: Motorola, RCA, Avian, Rantec, Leach, and Radiation. Every individual knows that Apollo requires a technical effort far above anything ever attempted in the field of space communications. A cautionary command, however, is handed down by NASA's Apollo Program Manager, Dr. Joe Shea.
He just didn't want a lot of state-of-the-art stuff in it that weren't tested. He wanted it to be a Volkswagen to go to the moon, and we made it that way.
Yet proven technologies wouldn't solve all the issues for a voyage that will carry 3 men nearly 500,000 miles to the moon and back. For the Mercury and later the Gemini missions, Collins Radio developed a separate module for each radio and data function. Each module operated on a different carrier frequency to serve the various needs. This system architecture is too large and heavy for Apollo missions to the moon. A better solution is needed. Engineers hypothesized that a single microwave carrier frequency could be used to simultaneously transmit all voice and data. It would be similar to how today's smartphones unify voice communication, radio, television, and text-based messaging into a single system. For Apollo, voice communication, the tracking of the spaceship's position, data from the spacecraft, and television signals could all potentially be transported by just 2 transmissions, one from Earth to space and one from space to Earth. The transmitter on the Apollo command module would range between 2.5 to 11 watts, comparable to the amount of power needed to illuminate a handful of Christmas lights. Sharply focused radio beams from large ground antennas would be required for error-free, reliable communication and navigation. The beams would have to be extremely accurate to connect to a moving spacecraft while the Earth and Moon are also moving. Such a system is possible, and Collins Radio makes major contributions to its development and is responsible for its implementation. It's called the Unified S-band System. It will be the moon-bound astronauts' only link to Earth. In a national television interview, Arthur Wolfsberg describes how it works.
It is essentially a multiplex type of system, just as our voice is transmitted along with the picture simultaneously on a television signal or your stereo FM. We combine a number of signals on one radio channel. Well, the major stations on Earth, of course, are located at Goldstone, California, near Madrid, Spain, and near Carnarvon, Australia. Collins Radio also supplied these major deep space network stations. The 3 stations have 85-foot parabolic antennas, a really tremendous structure, and this is what's part of the reason why we can use such low power from the command module transmitters.
The 3 stations with the 85-foot diameter antennas are strategically located around the globe, so at least one always has the moon in sight. They provide the high gain necessary to make the deep space connection. 11 stations, each with a 30-foot diameter antenna, provide horizon-to-horizon coverage while Apollo orbits the Earth. These ground stations are augmented by United States Navy tracking ships and military transport aircraft. The ground stations, ships, and aircraft make up NASA's manned spaceflight network and are linked to the Mission Control Center in Houston. Collins Radio played a major role in the development of what would become the manned spaceflight network beginning in the 1950s. The ground stations were initially designed to track deep space probes. Collins developed and manufactured the antennas and electronic equipment under contracts with NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. During this time, the company gained extensive experience in satellite communication, terrestrial microwave links, troposcatter UHF links, and large parabolic dish antennas. With this expertise, Collins systems experts in Dallas design and install the new unified S-band equipment and add antenna sites to the global network that will track and communicate with Apollo spacecraft. The responsibility for developing and building most of the unified S-band equipment for the command module rests with Collins employees in Cedar Rapids. NASA demands the new equipment be lightweight and have a low power consumption. The spaceship's fuel cells provide only a limited source of electrical power. A full-scale mock-up of the command module is built in a Collins laboratory in Cedar Rapids to help engineers design the installation. Initially, NASA wants removable units that can be replaced with onboard spares.
The first part of the program, they were going to have spares in the capsule, and the astronauts would change out boxes and so forth. About 2 years into it, they gave that up and started over. In the first place, it was way too heavy, the whole capsule.
NASA's next plan calls for Collins Radio to build redundancy into the equipment.
There was one box that we built that had 4 paths through it. You could have 3 failures in that box, which we didn't have, but we could have 3 failures and still the box would still work. And we knew that if the communication failed, it was a good chance that some of them wouldn't get back, if not all of them. And that was on our mind almost all the time.
Once the equipment is developed, it undergoes extensive testing.
Every component had to be tested and qualified. Such things as shock tests, vibration tests. The vessel that was going to carry the spacecraft away from the Earth, when it starts up, it vibrates like this. Well, you have to design your equipment to take that type of shake so it will survive the mission.
The final spacecraft communication system delivered by Collins Radio contains 12 modules. Together, they weigh about 195 pounds and have a total power consumption of about 150 watts. Building only high-quality, reliable equipment is a core value at Collins Radio. It's a standard set by Arthur Collins when he first began his company. In 1933, Collins Radio supplied transmitters that operated in the extreme temperatures of the Antarctic during Admiral Richard Byrd's historic polar expedition. Now, employees on the Apollo program work tirelessly to continue that standard of exceptional quality in their workmanship.
The idea was to get the job done correctly. And I remember times we slept under tables at night because we had meetings in the morning.
Collins' commitment to quality in Project Apollo is formalized with the Zero Defects program. Astronaut Ed White travels to Cedar Rapids to launch the initiative with a motivational speech. But his later comments to a group of women assembly operators has an unintended consequence.
After he gave his inspirational speech, he was in the assembly area talking with the women that were putting radios together that would go into the spacecraft. After hearing his comments about how important this was to the safety of the radio astronauts and himself in the future, it bothered him. There was a severe soldering spec placed on us in the contract, and it bothered the girls so much that they were afraid that their solder joints may break and endanger the lives of the astronauts. And because of this, 2 of them came in the next day and they asked to be transferred off of the program, and another 2 resigned from the company.
3 years later, Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee are preparing for the Apollo 1 mission. The 3 are sealed in the capsule atop the launch pad for a launch rehearsal test. A stray spark, possibly from damaged wires near Grissom's couch, starts a flash fire in the pure oxygen environment. Unable to quickly open the hatch door and escape, the astronauts perish on January 27, 1967. The ensuing months are tough and trying times for all involved in the Apollo program. The tragedy deeply affects Collins Radio employees. White and Chaffee have visited the Cedar Rapids facility shortly before the accident. The Apollo program is delayed while every piece of the command module is investigated to determine the cause of the fire. The Collins equipment is sent to Cedar Rapids to be analyzed by a select group of employees.
A gentleman named Lou Christensen explained to me the circumstances. They set up this green room secure area, and it was physically secure, a lot of security around it, and people were not allowed in there because the equipment from the burned spacecraft had been brought up there and placed in test conditions. And they tore it apart and looked at it and determined that there was never a problem with the Collins gear. But this all had to be carefully documented and had to be done according to rules and procedures that were set up ahead of time.
A few months after the tragic accident, North American Aviation merges with Rockwell Standard, another aerospace manufacturer, forming North American Rockwell. The company orders extensive design changes to improve crew safety. Many believe it might not be possible to recover in time to fulfill President Kennedy's goal to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. But a pivotal point in the program comes 11 months later to the unmanned test flight of Apollo 4. It's the first launch of the Saturn V launch vehicle with the command module on top. The three-stage rocket stretches more than 36 stories towards the sky. John Zimmerman, along with his wife Maxine, were at the launch complex the early morning of November 9th when Apollo 4 blasted off.
We were about 1.5 miles from where the rocket was, and what they don't tell you is on the countdown, that thing has to build up a little force to get off the pad, and you had fire going out of these tubes all over, and the rocket wasn't moving. And it seemed like forever, but it was about 4 seconds later, the thing lifted off and could go.
The test flight lasts almost 9 hours. The rocket performs correctly. Portions of the unified S-band system to be used on future Apollo flights are tested and function flawlessly. It isn't the only Collins system to perform successfully, however. Collins Radio has developed an elaborate ground voice intercom system at the launch complex. Called Radio Interior Communications, or RADIC, it contains 2,000 radio stations on a closed-loop cable system. The Collins team in Dallas designed the system that connects the 52-story Saturn V assembly building, Crawler Way Road, launch pads, launch pad mobile towers, and control center blockhouse. When Apollo 4 lifts off, the vibration from the rocket's 7.5 million pounds of thrust shake the launch control center and press building a couple miles away. An expendable RADIC station, located close to the launch pad, is blasted by the tremendous heat and vibration of the rocket. When the launch area cools down, NASA personnel find the station torn from its mount and hanging by its coaxial cable. All the control knobs are melted. NASA personnel pull the circuit cards out of the burnt radio and push them back in. To their surprise, the internal circuitry survived the blast, and the radio operates just as well as the hundreds of others at the launch complex. It's a profound testament to the ruggedness and durability of Collins equipment, qualities necessary for a mission to the moon. NASA conducts 2 more test flights, Apollo 5 and 6. At the time, Mike Yakos was a young engineer, responsible for the radio frequency communication checkout equipment for North American Rockwell. He becomes part of Collins Radio a few years later when the company merged with North American Rockwell. During one of his trips to Cape Kennedy, communication was lost between the remote checkout equipment and the spacecraft. As the junior engineer, he was chosen to go figure out the problem. This meant going to the top of the spaceship, 363 feet in the air.
They sent me out to the launch pad 39, so I go there and check in. The guy says, "Oh yeah, we're expecting you." So we're going up the elevator, and you only could go up so far, then you have to walk up the step to get up to the highest command module level. And the guy tells me, "Oh, by the way," he says, I got a safety thing for you." He says, "Okay, what's that?" He says, "If you see these red lights and these horns starting to go off, get off this thing as fast as possible." I'm still looking down like that, and I said, "Well, that's really nice. You got any ideas on how to do that?" He says, "Oh yeah, no problem. You see this thing up here, it was like a T-bar, and there was a guy wire. It was attached up to the gantry, and it kind of went down at about a 45-degree slant, and it ended up in a pond about a quarter of a mile away." So he said, "Grab onto these things and start sliding." I says, "Have you tested that?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "No problem. We put a dummy on this thing last week and sent the dummy down, and the only thing that happened is his legs broke."
Yakos was able to troubleshoot the problem and return safely to the ground. Almost 2 years after the fatal Apollo 1 fire, NASA is ready to launch a crew into space in a brand new ship. On October 11, 1968, Walter Cunningham, Walter Schirra, and Don Isley lift off on board Apollo 7. Flying in a low Earth orbit for 11 days, the astronauts check out the command and service module systems. 4,000 persons are on duty operating the ground communication and tracking stations making up the global manned spaceflight network. For Collins Radio, it's the first major operational test of the unified S-band system. The complex Apollo spaceship and mission generate much more data than the Mercury and Gemini flights. It's all handled capably by the unified S-band system. Apollo 7 clears the way for a lunar orbit mission that comes sooner than expected. NASA has scheduled the next 2 Apollo missions to include tests of the lunar module, first in a low Earth orbit and then in a higher Earth orbit. But production delays with the lunar module threaten to slow down the program. Time is ticking. The end of the decade is quickly approaching, and NASA doesn't want to find itself in second place in the space race with the Soviet Union again. The Soviets' Zond 5 has just become the first unmanned spacecraft to circle the moon. The Zond 6 is about to launch for a second lunar trip, arousing suspicion that the Russians might soon send cosmonauts to the moon. NASA decides to modify the mission sequence. Apollo 8 won't have a lunar module as originally planned, but it will carry 3 astronauts to the moon. The year 1968 will end with a historic Christmas voyage. It will give Americans a chance to look towards the heavens to reaffirm their faith in their country. In 1968, the United States appears to be ripping apart at the seams. The nation's illusions of innocence are shattered. More than 500,000 young soldiers are fighting in Vietnam with no end to the conflict in sight. U.S. and South Vietnamese militaries suffer heavy casualties in the Tet Offensive launched by the North Vietnamese and Communist Viet Cong. Anti-Vietnam War protesters call for an end to a war they believe their country should not be fighting. President Lyndon Johnson makes a shocking proclamation.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Everyone with a cause takes to the streets. Many protests result in clashes with the police. There are marches for civil rights. Women's groups protest against gender inequality. There is even a struggle between young and old, a generation gap. Don't trust anyone over 30 becomes a slogan for the youth. The country loses 2 inspirational leaders. In April, civil rights activist Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated while standing on the second-floor balcony of his Memphis hotel. His murder results in riots across America. Cities are set on fire. Senator Robert Kennedy pleads for calm. 2 months later, Kennedy is slain at a Los Angeles hotel moments after celebrating a victory in the Democratic California presidential primary. As his funeral train travels from New York City to Washington, D.C., nearly 2 million Americans stand by the tracks paying tribute to him. Later in the summer, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago is overshadowed by a bloody clash that erupts between thousands of protesters and riot police. By the end of 1968, Americans are angry about the Vietnam War, worn down by division and sick of violence. Apollo 8 brings the country together for a rare moment of hope and optimism. On the morning of December 21st, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders are strapped in an 11-foot command module. It's the first manned mission with the Saturn V rocket. It's the only rocket powerful enough to propel the Apollo spaceship to the moon.
12, 11,
At 7:51, the 5 engines of the rocket ignite and thrust the 3 astronauts into Earth
the
orbit.
engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have liftoff. Liftoff.
In the second turn around the planet, the Saturn V's third stage fires, putting Apollo 8 on course for the moon. Borman, Lovell, and Anders are the first human beings to leave Earth. Their only link to home for the next 6 days is the unified S-band system, developed by Collins Radio, its subcontractors, and NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
We hear you loud and clear, Apollo 8.
It cannot be overstated how vital the performance of the unified S-band system is to the success of the mission and the safety of the astronauts. It provides clear and reliable voice communications and the exchange of life-critical digital data. It also provides highly precise steering of the large antenna dishes to track the spacecraft, as well as the mechanism to measure the distance from Earth to the spacecraft. This distance measuring feature is accurate to about 50 feet in deep space. 69 hours after liftoff, Apollo 8 makes a historic rendezvous with the Moon. The astronauts are 240,000 miles from home, the farthest any humans have traveled before. As the tiny spacecraft disappears around the backside of the Moon, radio signals are blocked and the crew loses communication with Earth.
On the other side.
It's during this phase of the mission that the astronauts must precisely fire the service module rocket for the first time to slow down the craft and put it in orbit around the Moon. If the rocket burn is too long, the spacecraft crashes into the Moon. If it is too short, it forces a premature return to an unknown Earth orbit. The crackled silence puts Mission Control on edge for nearly 40 minutes. Mission Control calls out to Apollo 8.
Apollo 8, Houston, over. Apollo 8, Houston, over. Apollo 8, this is Houston. Verify your evaporator water control and automatic, over.
And then...
Go ahead, Houston, this is Apollo 8.
We've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit. By 60.5. Good to hear your voice.
Apollo 8 is floating just 70 miles above the Moon, providing an eyeball view of a desolate, cratered, and mountainous surface. Citizens of Earth are brought along on this pioneering voyage through their television set. The crew presents 6 live broadcasts. Their voices and images travel 250,000 miles through harsh space via Collins radio equipment and systems. The astronauts show Americans, and most of the world, the Moon as we've never seen it before. But even more incredible is the view of Earth. And what a view it is. Anders captures the iconic image, Earthrise, a sight the astronauts behold as they round the far side of the Moon. Maxine Zimmerman, a former Collins radio assembly operator, recalled the excitement of seeing these images for the first time.
Young people today who've seen pictures of the Moon don't understand that that's when we saw the first time the Moon. And then the Earth, we never did see what the planet Earth looked like from the air. That was so exciting as well.
The astronauts also have work to do during their 20-hour mission, orbiting Earth's satellite. The crew tests equipment and locates and photographs features on the Moon, giving special attention to future Apollo landing sites. On Christmas Eve, they present their final broadcast from lunar orbit. Millions of people all around the world tune in. It's the most watched live television broadcast to date. It's another historic moment for Arthur Collins and his company. 3.5 decades earlier, explorer Admiral Byrd broadcast from the unknown polar region of the Antarctic via Collins radio transmitters. Now, Collins radio equipment is transmitting the voices and images of a new generation of brave explorers orbiting an unknown celestial body. In their final Moon talk, the astronauts offer their most poetic descriptions of the lunar body.
The vast loneliness up here of the Moon is awe-inspiring, and it makes you realize just what you have back there on Earth. The Earth from here is a grand oasis of the big vastness of space.
Then, they close with a moving reading of the first 10 verses of the book of Genesis.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day.
God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
It was Christmas, which is a special time. Apollo 8 was the first manned flight outside of the influence of the Earth's gravity. So that in itself was astounding. But there was kind of almost a reverential atmosphere because of the holidays, because of the preceding year, and because of what they were accomplishing. I don't think anyone was prepared for that interesting choice of reading from the Bible, but it was quite effective.
Apollo 8 now begins its 10th revolution and final pass behind the moon. Again, a critical phase of the mission lies ahead. Astronauts must ignite the service module engine to increase velocity and break out of lunar orbit. If the rocket burn is unsuccessful, the spaceship is doomed to circle the moon forever. The fate of Apollo 8 is unknown for an agonizing 37 minutes of radio silence.
Apollo 8, Houston. Apollo 8, Houston.
As the spacecraft emerges from behind the moon, these few words over Collins' equipment bring relief to an anxious world.
Houston, Apollo 8, over. Hello, Apollo 8. Please be informed there is a Santa Claus.
Apollo 8 is on its way home.
Apollo 8 was the first manned flight to leave Earth orbit, the first to travel to the moon, and the first to orbit another celestial body. This flight was also a critical test of unified S-band, which performed flawlessly, transmitting data, telemetry, TV, and the astronauts' voices over these vast distances. The employees of Collins Radio led the enormous task of developing and manufacturing the groundbreaking S-band communication system, and shared the pride of the nation at the success of Apollo 8.
The next challenge is to land humans on the moon and return them safely to Earth. This will be a new test for the unified S-band system to maintain communication between the Earth, the lone astronaut orbiting the moon, and the two men who will land on the moon and explore its surface. Collins Radio will take us there, live.